I developed a severe stutter, a speech impediment, which made it really hard for me to even say sentences. My parents put me in speech therapy. Now, when I look back upon my life, I was able to get public speaking practice for over 10 years, Wednesday afternoons, going to the hospital for sick kids. And most young people never get that training. When I travel around the world and I meet young entrepreneurs, they're finding ways to transform scarcity into abundance by building something of value for others. In any field, you can have an entrepreneurial state of mind if you're operating with resource constraints.
Welcome to Intersections, my friends. Today, I have with us a very dynamic entrepreneur and an organizational leader, Asheesh Advani. He is the CEO of JA Worldwide. It's one of the largest social impact networks in the world, serving over 12 million young people in over 100 countries, delivering hands-on experiential learning programs in areas like financial literacy and work readiness and entrepreneurship. During his leadership of this organization, it's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for 3 consecutive years in an organization that is teaching things like financial literacy and entrepreneurship. What does that have to do with world peace? We will have the conversation with Asheesh very soon. He is an accomplished entrepreneur on his own, having led 2 venture-backed businesses from startup to acquisition, and those were chronicled in case studies in Harvard Business School. He is an active speaker and a regular contributor at major conferences, having served as a panelist or moderator at the World Economic Forum, which is where I had the pleasure of meeting Asheesh earlier this year. At the United Nations, the YPO, the Young Presidents Organization, and a number of Fortune 500 gatherings as well. Previously, he served as a columnist for Entrepreneur Magazine and has written 2 books about business finance. His latest book, Modern Achievement, published in August this year. Real pleasure to have you with us, Asheesh. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for that generous introduction.
Yeah, no, it was very energizing to meet you at Davos. I mean, there's just the electricity of that place itself, but spending time with you, I could sense that you are someone who holds very precious every moment in life, and seeks to do meaningful things with it from a place of positivity and possibility. And I want to start the conversation by actually borrowing from one of your own playbook elements, which is that you talk about how you love when you meet people to ask about their family. What was it like sort of growing up in their family? Can we start right there? And can you talk a little bit about your family and what it was growing up as Asheesh?
Turning the tables and asking me my own question. This is very meta. Well, my family story is not unlike many other immigrants. Let me start with that. I moved to Canada when I was young, when I was 6 years old, and my family grew up. My parents grew up in India, actually in Sindh, before partition. So at partition, they had to move, and my father's family moved to India. My mom's family moved actually to Malaysia.
Sindh is
After
what is now part of Pakistan, correct?
That's right. So, and I will tell you, this is a very emotional thing because I've never had a chance to visit Pakistan. I've always wanted to, and I am making a trip there soon. So this is a momentous occasion for me to rediscover my roots. Of course, I've never lived there myself. So I only spent 6 years in India. So really, I grew up in Canada, and I ended up marrying an American and moving to the States at a young age. So my professional upbringing has been, my educational upbringing was in Canada. And then I moved to the US and spent some time studying in England. Largely, I've lived in Boston for most of my life.
What is like one of the most memorable stories you have of your growing up years? Something that every now and then your mind just naturally sort of goes back to.
I think one of the stories that's in the book that's probably relevant for this conversation is when we were leaving India to come to Toronto, Canada, we flew through Amsterdam. And I got lost in the Reich Museum in our stopover in Amsterdam. We spent a short time there, and I was lost for several hours, and I was 6 years old. And that apparently ended up being a sufficiently traumatic event When we landed in Canada and when I got accustomed to the new place we were living, I developed a severe stutter, a speech impediment, which made it really hard for me to even say sentences. And there are many different types of stutters. There's the type where you have quick repetitions, and then there's the type where you open your mouth and nothing comes out because you can't get the first sound out. And I had the latter, which made people think that I either couldn't talk or was reticent to talk, or they just couldn't understand why I wasn't able to answer the question they asked me. So when you're a kid, particularly in a new country, and in my case with a bit of a funny name, Asheesh Advani in Canada in those days was a bit of a funny name. At least before Barack Hussein Obama made it cool to have funny names. I had a name that was maybe a little bit hard to pronounce for some, or easy to make fun of. And so it was really hard, frankly, for me to think of myself as a leader or think of myself as somebody who could accomplish much, mainly because of my stutter. And I'll tell you more about some of the lessons I learned and what helped me get over it. But you asked specifically about a childhood memory. Well, being lost in Amsterdam in the Rijksmuseum for several hours is probably one of the ones I picked for this.
Thank you for sharing that, Ashish. We do share something common in our heritage. My father also grew up in a part of undivided India that is now in Pakistan, and there are some powerful stories I'm sure you carry from your father and mother, just like I do from him. About that very, very painful but very formative episode in their life. About your own path. Wow, that moment in Amsterdam, 6 years old, and you get lost, and it's for hours of time. Do you have an actual recollection of that, or is that something that your parents told you about later?
No, I actually remember it's my first time out of the country, so a lot of the memories are very stark of taking the airplane and being in the museum and meeting these tall blonde men who in their security guard uniforms at the entrance to every one of the many, many rooms in the museum. I remember not paying attention to the art at all and only paying attention to what these kind blonde men were telling me to do to find my parents. The stutter could have been because of that. Nobody really knows, but definitely the move as well to a new country could have made a big difference. A lot of young kids actually stutter when they're in their 6 or 7 years old, but the number that continue to stutter throughout their teenage years is I feel for so many people when I hear them stumble on words, particularly ones who've got a persistent stutter, because I had that immediate empathy. Joe Biden, for example, has been talking publicly about his stutter, and you immediately have an affinity for people who've gone through that.
You were kind enough to give me an early copy of your book, and I wanted to see if you could share a little bit with our audience the growth journey that you took from that moment, having struggled with a stutter, both in terms of mastering, that issue and affliction, but also achieving and experiencing some other forms of growth since then. I thought that was very, very remarkable. Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I went through, and everyone's got their own story with a speech impediment or anything they have to overcome in their childhood. But my story is, I remember having to, for example, make a speech in school in front of all of the parents and teachers and students. And I remember it quite well because I had to recite the poem in Flanders Fields. And I literally could not get the words out of my mouth. And I stumbled my way through what should be, a minute or so on stage, to what felt like to me an hour, but it was probably about 10 minutes on stage. And just feeling so ashamed, like I'd let everyone down, just really let everyone down. And on the more positive side, my parents put me in speech therapy. So on Wednesdays after school, I used to go to this hospital called the Hospital for Sick Kids in Toronto, which is a very big hospital. And the speech therapist made me practice basically extemporaneous speaking. So, and I have to start each sentence with what's called an easy onset. And that methodology and the exercises that she put me through, which was to come up with, I had to find ways to talk about topics most kids would never have to dream about. She'd give me these topics like buttons or artificial intelligence or, airplane travel. And I'd have to very extemporaneously speak about it for 2 minutes with this methodology of easy onsets where you start by letting out a breath and starting each sentence slowly. And I learned to change words in my head very rapidly. So usually stutterers know that they're going to actually stumble on a word before they say it. So therefore, you become good at changing the word. So if I knew, for example, I'm going to stutter on the word podcast, I would probably change it to this radio conversation we're having, with this audio conversation we're having. So anyway, I became very good at extemporaneous speaking. So now when I look back upon my life, I look at this as actually a blessing where I was able to get public speaking practice for over 10 years, Wednesday afternoons, going to the hospital for sick kids. And most young people never get that training.
This is what, over 10 years?
Yeah, between 6 and probably between 7, probably took a year to start and right through high school.
I mean, it's a powerful story, and one of the things I'm drawn to is this notion that what we sometimes diagnose as enduring conditions, or diseases, etc., can actually oftentimes be, perhaps in some ways, in a more empowered way, viewed as states, not traits, as though there's a state of being that we are in during which we have been, you know, imprisoned by that condition. But if there are things we do, it may be possible, for some of these things that we consider to be enduring afflictions, to actually be able to move ourselves beyond them, whether it's based on the neuroplasticity, aspect of the brain, or some other kinds of resets that some have been able to find. So in my case, for instance, I was diagnosed with a chronic disease about 10 odd years ago. I share that story also in my book. And, if I went to Columbia Medical School and the National Institute for Health, basically they were saying it's progressive and irreversible, incurable. And yet, in my case, by having made some diet changes over 2 years, during which I didn't see any progress for 2 years, but 2 years later, the symptoms disappeared. And, over the next few years, my body healed and it's never come back. So what I see in your story is kind of like almost an invitation to who knows how many of us who may have been given a certain frame that this is who you are and this is what it's going to be like for you in life. And in some cases, we have to respect Mother Nature and these kinds of situations that we find ourselves in. For example, you lose an arm painfully so in a war. You can get a prosthetic, but it's pretty much likely that you're not going to grow back the arm. And yet, short of that, there's just so many of these other limitations that we sometimes impose, on ourselves, right? And so I hear a story like yours and the willful, committed, enduring sort of work, that it took. But ultimately, emerging from that is not just somebody who has overcome a condition, but who has gained so many new strengths on the basis of, all that you had to do to work your way out of it. I mean, that is incredible. This part that you talked about how you kind of sense when that stutter is coming and you pivot to a new word. I mean, that must have built some incredible improvisational skills in you.
Well, I think a lot of stutterers actually are very, very adept at switching vocabulary and uh, being able to minimize the public embarrassment that comes from not being able to speak at times. Hearing your story, though, about overcoming your own disease or affliction, it just reminds me that when you get through a difficult moment, it helps you build resilience. But the next question is, in addition to the resilience, does it change your perspective on what you want to do and the impact you want to make? And I know it did for me. I'm curious. I know you're interviewing me, but let me interview you for a minute. Has it changed your perspective on the impact you want to make because of the fact that you went through this?
Yes, I mean, in two ways. One is just my own relationship with food and with my body and with health. And then, honoring these and honoring that relationship between nature and your body and the act of nourishing it through the right food rather than just seeing it as a playground and, just kind of grabbing lunch, or rushing through something or etc. So there's that part, which is more personal to me. But the other part, which is more broader, is of course, you can imagine how enthused and impassioned I get whenever I meet anybody who is suffering through this or any related sort of chronic diseases, because I now have certain pathways, that I can expose them to, certain people who have been able to use, food and lifestyle kinds of mechanisms through which to go ahead and, over a period of time, with patience, get themselves to a much better place of enduring health. So yeah, absolutely, become a natural sort of, in a sense, solution provider and evangelist for that kind of lifestyle change based approach towards dealing with chronic issues. So And so for you,
Yeah, no, my case, in addition to the resilience piece, which I do think is important, so glossing over it isn't necessarily the right thing to do, but focusing on the fact that by virtue of reaching young people at the time of their life in their teenage years, where they start to develop who they are and who they can become, that has become a much more important part of my life. And I know that going through what I did, both the stutter and basically all the extracurricular things I got involved with and how it helped me build leadership skills, has really made me think that the impact of that you can have on somebody's life is substantial. And I would never have known that, frankly, if I hadn't kind of reflected deeply on this part of my journey.
yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, what I find very special in that is our capacity to pursue really challenging paths and arrive at really, beautiful outcomes by doing, tenacious and really sort of mindful, committed work, overcoming all kinds of challenges. That is fueled by the deepest convictions that we bear, at the very core of our being. And I think what I'm hearing from you is how, by having experienced some of those, moments in your life, it has embedded in you deep conviction about something like what you just said, that period in the life of the youth, which fuels you, I'm imagining, in your path of, being that much more present for them and being of service to them through your organization. How is it that an organization like yours, has been nominated for a Peace Prize? Can you talk a little bit about sort of the relationship between equipping people with resilience and financial and business skills and entrepreneurship and peace in the world?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So let me start by saying that our organization is very global. So we have operations on the ground in over 100 countries. I think it's now 118. And we have staff on the ground. We have great local leaders. In some cases, in some countries like the US and Canada and Sweden, not only do we have a national leader, but we've got leaders in every state or every community spread across, most of the provinces and states. So our organization helps young people develop self-belief by teaching business skills, entrepreneurship skills, and financial skills. In addition, we help young people see themselves and build prosperity for themselves and their communities. So, by virtue of us connecting the dots, let's call it between entrepreneurship, economic empowerment, so young people being economically empowered, and prosperity, which I think that connection between economic empowerment, prosperity, and peace is one of the things I'm most proud of, and why I believe this honor of being nominated allows us to bring attention to this, which is not usually a connection people draw, particularly around the Peace Prize. The Peace Prize traditionally has been given to organizations really associated with conflict and war, not necessarily organizations, although, like, for example, UNICEF won the Peace Prize as an example of an education organization that won. Médecins Sans Frontières is a great organization, Doctors Without Borders, another NGO. It's been given to individuals about two-thirds or three-quarters of the time, and organizations for the balance. And this, I call it preventative approach to peace, where you can imagine you can take conflict zones like, in Africa and the Middle East right now, where young people are so agitated that they don't have economic prospects for themselves. Of course, they're going to get drawn into terrorism, for example. And we've seen our programs in a place like Nigeria, for example. We operate in Nigeria and have been there for over 20 years. We operate in parts of Nigeria as well, or have been in the past, where we reach young men to allow them to see themselves as entrepreneurs and business people, just like I saw myself, differently as a kid. And that allows you to change a life trajectory to keep people away from things like terrorism if they can see themselves as being able to earn a living for themselves and their families, their communities.
This podcast is intentionally called Intersections because I love finding, things that we can dissolve boundaries. And one that I'm seeing being dissolved here is the distinction between like social good and the pursuit of peace, and then material advancement and the enterprise of business, almost, entrepreneurship as a financial money making kind of quest, but in a way that creates, obviously, good value for people in the community. And the idea that, these don't have to be at odds with each other. These don't have to be seen as very distinct and separate parts of our, social, world, they actually interact a lot, with each other. And a business can be an incredible force for peace and good, and done in the right way. So you have actually traveled that path of being, an entrepreneur in a more conventional business context, and then moved on to where you are today. So I want to come back to the present moment, but let's take a step back. Talk a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey, and in particular, what it has taught you about, the core elements and the power of entrepreneurship as just like a broad, capability and ethos to put out there in the world. Your own journey through entrepreneurship.
So I'll tell you about some failures. Let's start with failures. It's always more fun to hear the successes. So my first failure was I started a business when I was very young, just out of college, called the Business Minor. I was convinced because I'd gone to Wharton, and at the time it was really I think it was the only undergraduate business school in the Ivy League. So I met a lot of students who were studying engineering and physics and English and history and all sorts of things who really wanted to get a job in the business world. And they wanted to, one, signal to employers that they were different than all the other young people studying history and English and engineering. And they actually wanted to learn some very concrete skills so they'd succeed when they started their jobs. So I was editor of my school magazine in college, and we expanded the magazine to have, it was called the Wharton Account in those days. Magazines are long gone, I know, but in those days they were a thing. And we expanded the Wharton Account to all the Ivy League campuses. We recruited executive editors at each of the Ivy campuses, and we were able to, I would say, build a little mini following for students who wanted to study business and wanted to get jobs. In those days, the hot jobs were investment banking and management consulting. So based on that early experience, I thought, hey, let's create a business called the Business Minor to allow people who are studying something else to, in the summer, get a quote unquote minor degree with our branding with professors from the top universities.
I see. Yeah.
I still think, by the way, it is a great idea. So even though it was a dismal failure, probably because of my awful leadership at the time and no market research, but I still think it can be done.
Yeah.
So we built this business. It was with a friend. We learned very quickly that students who are paying thousands of dollars for their university education do not want to spend more thousands of dollars on their summers to get more education. So we just didn't do the research, frankly. We just didn't do the market research. We thought we'd launch. We were in love with things like branding and let's develop a beautiful, in those days you couldn't do websites. So it was let's develop a beautiful brochure to communicate this great idea. So that was my first failure. And I guess the big lesson there is you got to do the market research. Fast forward a little bit to the business I started, which was acquired. It's called Circle Lending. I started in my late 20s. I was 27. And it was one of the first person-to-person lending companies on the internet. So it allowed people to lend money to each other for things like buying a home, starting a business, paying for education, or getting out of high interest credit card debt by borrowing money off really their friends and family, their social network. This was pre-Facebook, so the idea of social networks didn't exist. So largely people were borrowing home loans from their parents or business loans from their friends and family, or education loans from their extended family. And we would document the loan, do all the loan servicing, do the credit reporting so you could build a credit history with the loans. And for mortgages, we would do the tax reporting so you could claim it as a tax deduction. And it was an amazing journey. It really was a business that found a niche and nobody else was serving the niche. And it was the early days of what we called social finance. I was interviewed in the New York Times and coined the term social finance, or at least I believe I can claim that. I'm sure others came along and also said it around the same time. That journey was a much more successful one for a number of reasons. And my entrepreneurial journey it made me believe more that entrepreneurs can do good for the world by virtue of the journey that we'd been on.
Yeah. Yeah. So that got you started on your path, in successful entrepreneurship. I know you've done a lot more. I want to just maybe invite you to give us a little bit of your definition of entrepreneurship. I know that many of us think of it kind of along the lines of what you've described, which is it's about like a big tech play, in creating some disruptive new something in the world. And yet you defined it in a much more broadly applicable way in your book. Could you talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. I do not think entrepreneurship should all be limited to definitions around, particularly what the press has been doing so well, particularly in the US, in elevating the tech businesses and really making entrepreneurship almost defined as high tech acquired businesses. When I travel around the world and I meet young entrepreneurs, they're basically finding ways to transform scarcity into abundance by building something of value for others. And you can do this as a self-employed person. You could do this as a person who hires others and builds livelihoods for others. You could, of course, do technology. There's so many different applications of how you can be an entrepreneur. I think at Babson, I used to be involved with Babson College, the Boston area, and they take entrepreneurship in a different direction. They think of entrepreneurship as a state of mind, as really, operating with resource constraints. And in any field, you can have an entrepreneurial state of mind if you're operating with resource constraints. I tend to view it a little bit more narrowly as turning scarcity into abundance.
I've sometimes thought of entrepreneurship as being equally in evidence in the Mother Teresas and the Gandhis as it is in any business context. The notion of having a certain vision or an idea and then galvanizing the forces around you towards advancing that, finding a way to create a viable and scalable approach towards, having some meaning and impact in the world, with what at the very start of it was just like a spark. How do you feel about extending it into the social domain as well?
Well, it's already happened. I mean, regardless of how I feel about it, I think it's social entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship are basically synonymous now. I meet a lot of young people. Let me give you one statistic, which will blow your mind, actually. So we have a program for young people in typically high school, sometimes middle school, to create a business while they're in school. The program is called JA Company Program. It's been around for 100 years. So this is our flagship program. It's been around ever since JA was created. And now it reaches between 400,000 to 500,000 young people per year. And this program, I go around and I meet quite a few entrepreneurs because a lot of our prize award ceremonies include the winners of this program. 70% at least of the young people who do this program are building businesses which have to do with climate change and sustainability. So they are, and I'm not sure if they'd call them social businesses, by the way. I think they just call them businesses. They just see a problem which needs to be solved, and they find a way to work on something, whether it's using recycled products. I'll just give you one example. A team in Indonesia, they took rubber from discarded tires and make purses and other very attractive high-end products from that rubber that look beautiful. It looks not quite like leather, but it has that sort of, I'll call it trendy feel of being new and different, made out of recycled rubber. It's really amazing. And they wouldn't define themselves, by the way, using the word social entrepreneur differently than entrepreneur. They think entrepreneur is what we may have called social entrepreneurship 20 years ago.
The idea of solving an important problem in society, which helps advance, livelihoods and, our humanity. And
well, they're making money. I mean, honestly, they found a way to make money and appeal to a customer set that cares deeply about helping the world, which, let's be frank, today is almost everyone. So it's an opportunity. It's a market opportunity.
Fantastic. Let's turn to your book. So modern achievement. Why the juxtaposition of the word modern with achievement? What's fresh and modern and different about how you're thinking about achievement? And by the way, you have a very eminent collaborator here in Marshall Goldsmith, and maybe you can spend a moment just talking about how both of you came together as well to do this.
Well, I'll start with why it's called modern achievement, and I'll tell you the Marshall story. So most achievement books are written with a traditional definition of achievement, which is all about achieving a goal and setting a long-term goal that you write down, you visualize, and through abundance and effort, you can achieve that long-term goal. The world, however, has really changed. So the predictability of being able to set a long-term goal and know that with certainty, you'll be able to maximize this environment around you to achieve it, it's just no longer true. With AI, just pick one trend, AI changing the world as fast as it is, where young people are going to have potentially at least 20 jobs and at least 7 careers. and over 40% of the skills they have today are going to be displaced or changed in the next 5 years. I mean, those are just statements of, largely fact based on what we're hearing from some of the reports that we're getting from experts. So if you believe those things to be true, then you have to look at achievement very differently. You've got to set multiple goals. You've got to be able to pivot. You have to find happiness in the journey to goal attainment, not just in the attainment of goals. And as I look back upon my life, and when Marshall, who I'll tell you the story about in a second, when Marshall looks back upon his life, we realize that much of our happiness came not from the attainment of goals, but from the journey and the process of achieving them. So with our own sort of personal experiences, and certainly from the experiences of the young people who I meet through Junior Achievement and some of the leaders I've met through Marshall, we came up with a set of lessons for young people, which are designed around this new concept of achievement.
So, Asheesh, in what you've just said, there is a lot of power to this notion of enjoying the process, almost like a timeless spiritual principle of pulling away just from the material obsession over reward. But you're grounding it in the current times, in the complexity and challenge of youth career pathing today versus what it was, when we were in our early 20s, which I like a lot. And I'm curious if there is another maybe implication of that, which is in addition to not being as attached to the outcome as you are in committing yourself to enjoy the process of the pursuit of excellence, is there also a kind of shift that this might help create of moving us away from a very comparison oriented sort of rank ordering and where am I relative to my peers, and am I outracing this person or that person, which was so much more the norm in a very singular lane based kind of approach that we divide all work into different lanes, different professions. And then, well, you're in that profession now for 20, 30, 40 years, and so you're starting to kind of map like how far down are you relative to somebody else. But if people are actually jumping lanes and crisscrossing and just developing their own very unique footprint in the course of their career, it kind of becomes almost like defunct to make these kinds of comparisons. Anyway, that's just a thought coming to my mind. Reactions?
Absolutely. It's already happening. I mean, rankings are becoming much less important. Let's just talk about college because it's easy and you're at Columbia. And Columbia is actually, I think, at the forefront of debunking some of this because there's a professor who I think looked at some of the flaws in the rankings, even from your university. But it's already happening. If the relevance of your first job is much less important than it used to be 20 years ago, where it was path dependent, if you didn't get that job at top firm X, Ford, IBM of the day, you couldn't have a successful career. Now, you could get a job at a startup that doesn't exist that has to do with AI, even if you start your career doing something totally different. So the idea of rankings being what should drive the way you perceive your purpose in life, that is going to change regardless of, I think, what's in my book or what thought leaders like you and I are advocating for. It's going to happen. And let me give you one other interesting insight I learned when I did this book. So there's a lot of pressure, I think, on young people to have their purpose, partly because people like you and I tell the world, you got to have your purpose. So parents start to think that, oh, my 18-year-old child, doesn't have clear career direction to guide all their myriad choices. But the reality is, for much of your early career, you have what's called ready-made purpose. Somebody has given it to you. Your school, your parents, your employer, your boss, your colleagues, your lover, whoever it is, has given you purpose. At some point in time in your life, you start to build self-made purpose. It comes at a different time for different people. For Greta Thunberg, who's very young, it came very early. But for many of us, it comes, almost after midlife. I think that's one of the insights in the book that I'm most proud of, because I've given a few speeches. In fact, I gave one at Columbia, and one of the dads came up to me afterwards and said, when I heard that, it really it released some pressure in him, because I think he was putting so much pressure on his daughter to have that sense of purpose. And he realized in that moment that it's just not that way at the age of 18 or 19.
In fact, it's funny, I was teaching a class on purpose to my executive MBAs a few years ago. And, we were talking about all the benefits that you get psychically when you feel a greater sense of meaning and attunement and a purpose to, what you're pursuing in your career and all of that. And he pushes back and he says, Professor, I actually get very frustrated with purpose. My instinct was to try to argue and debate him out of that. I had all the science to show the benefits of purpose and the stories and things like that. But I went into a moment of curiosity because, I've learned that over time, as they say that, when one teaches, two learn. So this was my moment to learn. So I said, I'm curious, tell me more. And then he revealed something to me, which was quite powerful for me. He said that, well, here's the thing, I have in my life pursued purpose. I've been actually very passionate about, a certain life direction for me. And then what has happened is along the way, I have just ignored certain other very important building blocks in my life sometimes. And I've also reached at times a point where I realized that actually this was the wrong purpose. And so I got very obsessed with something only to realize that I burned through years of my life. I didn't do service to certain other key parts of, what I should have been also in a balanced way invested in. And I got to a point where I look back and feel like it was the wrong thing for me. Anyways, this is very, very, eye-opening as well to, and so actually what that did for me is that it, helped me codify another of the principles that I offer around purpose, which is that sometimes life is inviting you to walk away from your current purpose, to have the courage to actually, you know, look at look at life and look at the situation and realize that you have perhaps outgrown it. You've discovered certain new somethings or the other, and shouldn't feel just over invested in something just because that's kind of where you have spent so much of your energy historically. So
Well, one of the things I like about your framework, leadership and flow, as you call it, it's about values and purpose. I think by focusing only on purpose, you actually, for some people, make them feel very insecure because they haven't discovered that one thing. But when you focus on values, everyone has values. There's a section in my book that's called the hero's exercise. I don't know if you're familiar with it. She's done it, and I've seen her do it on stage. Oh my God, it's so powerful. So her name is Aisha Bursell. She's actually the illustrator of the book as well. She's written a book called Design the Life You Love and another book called Design the Long Life You Love. And in her second book, she has this amazing exercise called the Hero's Exercise. And I learned from it. We did it at JA. I've done it in my YPO forum and other places. And we have it in my book because I think it's so powerful. It's a way for you to discover your values in a very clever way. I won't give it away. You sort of have to read the little paragraph. But I think every single person on earth after the age of, say, 12 can find some values that they identify with. But not everyone has a purpose, at least a self-made one. So it sometimes is challenging for people to be told that's how they should guide their decisions.
yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. There is sort of area where you're like pushing our collective thinking in I think a direction very very germane for today's time. And that has to do with leadership. And so we talked about purpose, we've talked about entrepreneurship, we talked about achievement. Maybe we should end with a discussion about leadership. And you highlight the importance of sort of environments today where increasingly so one has to move away from command and control. And one has to move towards something more collective and something where there is a sense of empowerment, that people feel and that they have. And within that, there is a certain framework for how to actually achieve that sort of balance between, on the one hand, needing to feel that you can control, and direct and shape the destiny or whatever it is that you're collectively seeking to lead and, move forward. But at the same time, do it from a place of a lot of like freedom and empowerment for the teams and the individuals involved. And you are at the helm of a large and highly complex organization that in theory could only be led that way because of some of the elements of its structure which I've discovered through my conversations with you and also some of your reflections in the book. So let's just talk about that for a moment. Can you share a little bit about sort of this new positioning around how to lead in today's time?
Sure. The framework that I introduced in the book, and we've been using at Jay for many years now, is called the Fixed Flexible Freestyle Framework. I learned it from Jonas Priesing, who actually leads an organization that has a different governance structure and set of decision rights. So I think this works for different types of organizations. It doesn't have to only work for networks of teams like JA. It could also work for hierarchical organizations, which are more traditional. Fixed, flexible, freestyle basically means there's some things that are fixed. One could say for a global organization, things which are global. And then there are things which are flexible, which vary based on time and place. So for a young person, a lesson that applies when you're a teenager would be different than a lesson that applies when you're 35. Or a lesson for a person living in Africa versus somebody living in Europe or in Asia would be different, for example. And we brought this to JA from a leadership standpoint. It's really helped me, and it's helped, I think, some of my colleagues who have roles which span geographies, because it makes it quick and easy to explain what needs to be fixed and why, what needs to be flexible and why, and what's truly bottom up, what's truly based on empowerment, local education. Of course, it's going to be different in Kenya versus in California, right? We want the local leaders of JA to have that full autonomy to make those decisions that are really relevant for the youth in their school systems. So that for JA, this really works well. I will say that my predecessor, I really want to compliment my predecessor who came now, it's been 10 years now almost in my role, or over 9 years. And he did such a good job of creating a framework and a common agreement for all the J entities around the world, right? 340 different entities, over 100 countries that they all signed. And so it's helped me as the person who came after him to put some easy language around this. Fixed, flexible, freestyle is really easy language. And we took this framework, we also put it in the book because I think it's a very versatile framework. It can be used for lots of things, this three-dimensional framework.
Thank you for sharing that. I really love it. At some level, I've encountered a two-level version of it, which is like what things are fixed and what things are adaptive or flexible or whatever. But I really love the extra nuance you get when you do it in a three-part thing. And I'm looking forward to diving more into that section of your book. I'm reminded a little bit about this reflection that the product manager of the original sort of iPhone development, at Apple, he shared. He said that, when Steve basically mandated that we pursue this path of, developing a path-breaking new approach to like phones, he said he didn't come to us and said, I want you to develop a phone with only one button, and if you remember, the early iPhones had one button, or with a touch screen or something. He said he came to us and he said, I want you to develop a phone that people fall in love with. That people would rather leave their wallets at home than leave their phones at home. And it's
Well, he got his wish.
yeah, exactly. you know, every time now I'm so much more casual about just leaving my wallet at home, knowing that I can go and pay for things also with my phone now. I'm remembering that moment with him. But yeah, but now coming back to what you were saying, I mean, it's just interesting that there he was in some ways empowering them, but also grounding them in something fixed, right? And the something fixed was like whatever you come up with, it better be something that in that period of history, I mean, people were not loving their phones. It was a functional device, a Motorola or a Nokia or something with tons of buttons and complexity. And he was saying, okay, make them fall in love with it, but I'm not going to tell you more. In closing, Asheesh, you are in touch with the pulse of youth across the world, being a leader of an organization like this, and with all the interest and commitment you have to youth. There is a prevailing narrative about how youths today are feeling a sense of hopelessness and struggling a little bit with their mental health, and post-COVID has become worse, and what have you. Is that the experience you have of our youth across the world, or is there anything you want to offer to refine or change or challenge that narrative?
So I guess asked this question fairly often, and it's a little bit frustrating, to be honest, because it's like my asking you, tell me about the adults of the world and what they all think. The reality is there are many, many different perspectives of young people based on where they live and what their personal story is. So one way I can now be a little bit more respectful and also articulate in this question I get asked all the time is we've developed a way to collect real voices of young people. So I'm not speaking for them, they're speaking for themselves. And we use AI to draw out common themes for what they actually are saying and what they actually believe. And so we have a website called youthvoices.org. And it's a beautiful website. I encourage you to go because we have a section of the website called Conversations. We did this in partnership with MIT Center for Constructive Communication and a nonprofit called Cortico. I highly recommend both of these organizations. Are doing great work. And you go to the website, you click on conversations, and literally you can click on any theme and it will find the segment of the conversation we had with a young person in Zimbabwe and a young person in California and a young person in England. And it will allow you to listen to it in their own voice, the common theme. So it will avoid people like me generalizing in a 1 minute answer to equate these three people's views, which are often similar but still different at some level. And I know that might be a highly unsatisfying answer to your last question, but I will end with something which should give you a little bit of hope. Of course, there's a massive mental health crisis. I used to think, by the way, the mental health crisis was confined to the US and Western Europe. But I've since learned the mental health crisis is even in developing countries, in places where I thought just because the data showed the young people are more optimistic about their future, they were not susceptible to mental health. So I do think there's something deeper here. However, the hope and optimism that young people have is an order of magnitude higher than what adults have in almost every country in the world, except I think three. So that should give you a bit of a sense of it's not all dire. And I based that data on the UNICEF project where they looked at the data across all these countries. I hope that leaves you with a sense of, 70% of young entrepreneurs are building businesses that address climate change, and young people are more hopeful and optimistic than people our age. So I hope that leaves you with a little bit of positivity at the end of this.
Yeah, very good. I mean, I actually know knowledge of where you would go with this question. So it's really both on the one hand affirming and really encouraging to hear about how you're seeing positive sides to the youth story, across the world. And at the same time, I'm very intrigued about this invitation you've given us to go and explore this the website that you've created. Can you repeat the website again?
Sure. Youthvoices.org. And JA's website is jaworldwide.org. And while we're promoting, the book website is modernachievement.com. So I've given you three websites to check out, and I'm really, passionate about all three of them. So go for it.
Wonderful. You were going to just share your path to collaborating with Marshall Goldsmith. Maybe you share that. We start closing out.
So Marshall did something amazing, and when he turned about 70, he decided that he wanted to teach everything he knows to 15 people. So he did a little video, he put it on LinkedIn, and he said, here's what I want to do in my phase of life. I want to teach everything I know for free to 15 people. If you're interested, please apply, and had a little form to apply. He got 17,000 applications. He was expecting like 100.
Yeah,
so
wow.
Then he decided he's expanded it to now what he initially said was 100 people, but he can't say no because he's a wonderfully generous man. So now it's several more than 100. So it's called 100 Coaches is the community. And I've gotten to know these amazing people. I became one of this group. And he's just sharing all of his wisdom for free with all of us. And all he's asked us to do in return is to do the same at some point in our life when we're ready for it as a paid forward project. So this book is a manifestation of that. He's sharing all his wisdom for free. We're giving all the proceeds to Junior Achievement from all the book sales. He's just a really, really generous person. And by the way, I think his idea is so good to do this that, I'd encourage you as well to, I know in many ways you're doing this already with Mentora, but it's such a wonderful way to think about how you can give back to others. So that's my interaction with Marshall and why we did this together.
How lovely. Yeah. No, I appreciate that very much. And kind of takes us back to some of the practices that used to happen in a world that preceded the more formalization of intellectual property and property rights and ownership of these of these ineffable, ephemeral, like knowledge like things, as opposed to like physical assets that exist in the world, right? And there's still cultures. I mean, you look at yoga, for example, right? Timeless, faceless, nameless truth seekers from ancient times who never really end up appropriating and even putting the names at times as authors of books or as teachers, and and it's freely available to the world. And it comes to America, and that's where it starts to get packaged and productized and branded as one kind of yoga, or another kind of yoga, or a third kind of yoga, with its own marketing around it. So I love that retreat to some of the core basics of knowledge and honoring that flow from one generation to the next. That's beautiful. Do you have anything you want to
Well, I
react
was
to?
just going to say that one of the things I'm most proud of at JA is we've built a culture in our organization where we all share IP. So if something is developed in some part of the world that could benefit somebody else in another part of the world, by being part of the Junior Achievement Global Network of organizations in these 340 different organizations, we actually share IP. And it's led to all sorts of amazing things where people are not just proud of what they've created, but they're proud of what they've adapted from what somebody else has done. And that is core to what makes us, I think, unique.
Thank you for sharing that. Ashish, in passing and closing, what are you most looking forward to in the next 10 years of your life? What is that? What is that dream that you want to sort of pursue and manifest?
Oh my God, I was not prepped for this question. This is a I I will have to give you a somewhat ambiguous answer because I don't have clarity in my own mind. I want to enjoy what I'm doing and I want to make a maximum impact with the skills that I have. I mean, that's the unfortunately unsatisfying answer to your very good question. There's a really good book. This might be more helpful to your listeners, by Gurcharan Das called "The Difficulty of Being Good." Are you familiar with the author Gurcharan Das?
This is very thoughtful
Yeah.
author and thinker. Yeah.
And he talks about, the sannyasin phase of life and how at that phase of life, which, for Hindus is sort of the last phase, where you start to really focus on reflection. I stumbled upon the book and I found it really enlightening. And while I don't think I'm quite there yet in terms of my life phase, I do think what Marshall has done with this Pay It Forward project has got me thinking about making sure that what I do next really is the kind of thing that allows me to sort of maximize the impact that I can have. So next 10 years, who knows? I hope it's as fun as the last 10 years have been.
Yeah, I mean, what I get from your answer is that you are very present in the present moment and you're like fully enjoying it very mindfully and are feeling very much at peace that you are where you're meant to be, for now. And that this is a quest that, is going to be quite enduring, for the foreseeable future.
I'm going to have you talk to my wife and tell her exactly that. That will be really great for our relationship. So thank you.
All right. Well, it's very poetic and beautiful to end with moment of honoring these people in our lives who mean so much and have shaped us in, I'm sure, incredible, powerful ways. Maybe, therefore, to end this, Ashish, you can share a story about your wife or a quality that you really admire now.
Well, she's in the book, actually. I was able to put some of my, so her name's Helen, and she's a very successful social entrepreneur in her own right. She runs a nonprofit that teaches science skills. The Science Fair organization has been around for 75 years, sends kids to the International Science Fair. She runs it here in Massachusetts. So we get to see the top business kids and the top science kids.
Yeah.
So I like to joke with her, and this is going to offend half of your listeners, but I'll make the joke that all the great science kids coming out of her program are going to end up working for JA Kids one day. It really drives her nuts when I say that. She's not here to defend the case. One of the many nice things I can say about her is she truly, I think, has helped me realize that you can put others before yourself and find personal happiness from doing so. I probably, when I grew up, thought, there's a trade-off between helping others and helping yourself. And she's the type of person who tells me to wipe the toilet seat, even if it's not dirty, because that's what you'd want somebody to do for you. And I'm like, wow, that is not something I thought I had to do when I was younger, but that's the kind of person she is.
Oh, how lovely. How lovely. Well, a warm greetings to her and thank you to you for, both the, effort you put in collaborating with Marshall, writing this very energizing book and in the moment you've taken here to reflect on your life and career with such joy. Really, I feel just a sense of joyousness, to the path you're on and the work you're doing. So, kudos, Ashish, and we need more of that, to ripple through across the world. So, thank you and wishing you all the best in your career and life ahead of increasing impact.
Thank you for this great conversation.